Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out on a beautiful day and making this afternoon's Entrepreneurons a priority. We are delighted to see you. My name is Laura Heisler, and I'm the Director of Programming for the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation. And WARF, along with the Discovery to Products Group, or D2P, on campus, are delighted to present this series to you. We just brought this series back this semester, and this will be our final installment for this academic year, and we are really excited to go out with a bang to introduce you to WARF's new Chief Venture Officer, Mike Parch, and I'm going to be giving you a little bit of background on Mike in just a moment. But first, what I'd like to do is tell you just a little bit about how this afternoon session is going to go so you know what to expect. We are going to be hearing from Mike on his vision and perceptions of the Madison area and the opportunity that this new enterprise that WARF has launched presents to the community. And then Mike's going to be joined on stage by Paul Richa, an attorney at Foley & Lardner, who is joining us in sponsoring today's event and today's networking reception. So Paul and Mike will have a conversation. Paul's a longtime veteran of the startup community here in Madison. He brings some really interesting perspectives, and I think it'll be a really vibrant discussion. We'll get to understand a little bit about where each of these two individuals is coming from. Then we're going to open things up for your questions. We record all of these sessions. You'll be able to find a recording in about a week or so on the WARF website. Because we record the sessions, we're going to ask you to wait for our mic runner to find you if you have a question during the Q&A. So raise your hand and we will run the mic over to you. And we're going to leave it to Mike Parch and Paul to look out on the crowd and figure out who they want to take a question from. So we ask that you do that, and we'll try to wrap up that portion of the afternoon right around 5 o'clock. There'll probably still be some questions, and so we want to invite you then to join us in the atrium right behind you. The doors behind you will open up, and you're welcome to join us for refreshments, beverages, food, and continued conversation. And Mike and Paul are going to stick around for a little bit, and it's a great opportunity to follow up with them, get to know them, and get to know each other. So that's how it's going to go. Please do grab a name tag if you don't have one already. That's your ticket to the reception. And if you didn't get an email from us, but you found out about this another way and you'd like to get emails, we do have sign-ups outside on the table where you grabbed your name tag. So please do let us know if you'd like to be added to our mailing list. We're going to bring this series back in the fall, and you'll hear from more from us then. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Mike Parch. Mike has 30 years of experience in venture investing and startup company development. He has concentrated on the life sciences industry since 1989, when as an undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania. He was a founding member of a biotechnology company called Neos Technologies. And Mike has said he got the bug then and it hasn't let go of him since. During those 30 years, he's developed a highly refined skill set aimed at forming and interacting with entrepreneurial management teams with a strong background in university-based spin-outs, making him perfect, of course, for this position. He received a dual major bachelor's degree in biology and philosophy of science with a minor in chemistry from Penn, and then holds an MBA from Carnegie Mellon University with dual concentrations in finance and entrepreneurship. His venture capital experience spans 4 firms: Acuitive Medical Ventures, Versant Ventures, EDF Ventures, and the CEO Venture Fund. He was also selected as a Kauffman Fellow, which is a prestigious 2-year postgraduate fellowship in venture capital sponsored by the Kauffman Foundation. And he continues to be involved with Kauffman, which sponsors networking and membership opportunities, as well as a forum for sharing best practices. His position at Versant Ventures, which is a premier $650 million healthcare-focused venture fund, lasted several years, and there he focused on medical device investing and played significant roles in more than a half dozen investments. Mike joined WARF last fall as our inaugural Chief Venture Officer, and in this capacity, he manages a venture fund and portfolio of $110 million, and will be sharing some of his initial impressions and plans with us over the course of this next hour. So please join me in welcoming Mike Parch.
Thank you. So, we're going to talk today a little bit about what WARF Ventures is, why I'm here, how do I fit in, why am I here, the ever-present existential question. What is WARF Ventures? Where does WARF Ventures fit into the whole WARF process? What the investment strategy is. So this is the part for those entrepreneurs in the audience who want to get cash from WARF Ventures. This is the part you want to pay attention to. I'll model out sort of the investment process, what I think of as the ideal situation for us to get involved. And then I'll go through some of the startup resources we have before we go into the Q&A with Paul. So I've spent 30 years in healthcare startups. I can't believe it. It seems like just yesterday I was a young sophomore at Penn where I was pre-med, wanting to cure the world of all sorts of diseases. And I worked in the lab of one of my professors. We came up with some neat ideas, got a patent, got some venture funding, and we created a company called Neos. The company went public eventually after I graduated, and I got hooked. I decided to start, decided not to go to medical school, but to focus on entrepreneurship and get into venture capital. So I went to Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. I'm a Pennsylvania native, so it made sense to stay in state, where I focused in finance and entrepreneurship. I worked part-time at a venture capital fund called the CEO Venture Fund, which this was in the mid-90s, and university startups were really starting to take off, and I was one of the few people in the area at the fund that had experience doing one. So I was labeled a university startup guy. So I did all the biotech startups coming out of Pitt and Carnegie Mellon. After my MBA, I got selected as a Kauffman Fellow, which, as Laura talked about, was a 2-year postgraduate fellowship in venture capital, and it also gets you sort of into a club of venture capitalists that you're a member of for the rest of your life. There's over 500 Kauffman Fellows now worldwide in every size and type of venture capital fund out there. So it's a tremendous network for me to be a part of and to bring to the Madison community here. I did my Kauffman Fellowship in Ann Arbor, Michigan, just across the lakes at a firm called EDF Ventures. While at EDF, we focused almost exclusively on Great Lakes regions universities, the primary one being Michigan, of course. But we also looked at Michigan State, Wayne State, Ohio State, and Wisconsin. While at Michigan, I actually co-founded a company called Handy Lab. I was a VC, but at the time, I was still looking at startups and technologies coming out of the tech transfer office. This was a lab-on-a-chip point-of-care diagnostic company. I convinced my venture firm to fund it. We created Handy Lab, and it eventually sold for $275 million to Beckley Dickinson. That was my first real experience with dealing with the tech transfer office firsthand. I also was involved in Intralace, an ophthalmic laser company, which eventually went public. Intralace is essentially the femtosecond laser that cuts the flap for the LASIK procedure. So if you've ever heard of all laser LASIK, that's this technology. Intralace was crucial for me because it was a springboard into Versant Ventures, which I'll talk to in a second. But I also looked at tomotherapy. As I mentioned, whenever I was in Ann Arbor, we did look at technologies coming out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and one of them that I was a big fan of was tomotherapy. I distinctly remember coming over to meet with Rock. He impressed me. We ended up not making the investment, but I still was very impressed with WARF, the kind of technology they had going on over here, the great resources of the university, and I was very impressed and excited about the opportunities. So as I mentioned, Intralace got the attention of a venture firm out in the West Coast called Versant Ventures. Versant recruited me to join them in Newport Beach, so I left sunny Ann Arbor for even sunnier Southern California. I spent almost 4 years in Versant, where I did exclusively, or nearly exclusively, medical device deals, which was interesting, being that I was classically trained as a biochemist and doing biotech deals. But medical device technology was fairly easy to learn. More, as my friends in the industry like to say, it's electricity, it's plumbing, it's physics, it's not physiology so much, so it's less gooey and more hard science. At Versant, I did a lot of operational roles as well as venture roles. I stepped in as a CEO a number of times in portfolio companies. Most notably, Glaukos was a company that now went public. They have a stent to help treat glaucoma in the eye. I was intimately involved with that company, as well as Inogen, a portable oxygen concentrator. I was on the board of that company for a number of years. Both of those companies ended up going public. I left Versant after 4 years to form Acuitive Medical Ventures, a medical device venture fund that was partnered with an incubator, a medical device incubator out of Atlanta, Georgia. And what I really enjoyed about Acuitive was the partnership with the incubator gave me insight into the technologies coming down the pipeline for me to consider investing in, which a normal venture fund doesn't have. Normally, as a venture fund, you have to take whatever comes in your door, you source deals, you try to find deals. You don't get as much insight into the background of the technology. Here, in this fund, Acuitive, we were able to talk with the inventors of the technology, the developers of the technology, the founders of the company, because they were in our sister company, the Innovation Factory. At Acuitive, I was involved with a company called Aquasys, which is another glaucoma treatment. This company was recently acquired by Allergan. I was also involved with Myoscience, which just very recently sold to Acira Pharmaceuticals. I ended up leaving to go run a medical device incubator that I founded. And this was my first real venture into multiple university tech transfer offices. At Accelemed, I worked with inventors at a number of different institutions, Stanford, mostly Stanford, but some USC, some Johns Hopkins, and we licensed technology in from different universities, created companies, advanced them through early stage clinical trials, proof of concept studies, and then would spin them out and recruit management to take over, and then I'd go back to the pipeline, working on the next deal in the pipeline. So I worked with USC, as I mentioned, Johns Hopkins, mostly Stanford. We created companies like Cervell, formerly known as Neostim, then became Cervell. Nalu, a medical device neurostimulation company that's doing quite well in the Bay Area. And then most recently Interistim, a GI neurostimulation project. So in 30 years, I've helped create or be a part of a number of logos, which was really interesting. But how does that get me here to WARF? Well, you start thinking about what WARF was looking for in a person to run the ventures office. And there were three critical components, and that was university startups and knowledge of them, how they work, venture capital, how to set up a venture capital fund, and then technology licensing. And so I've sort of hit all three of those key components very heavily in my career. So I was very excited to join WARF and to be a part of this team. And I'm looking forward to working together with the community here and creating a lot of new WARF-based startups. So WARF Ventures, what is it? Well, the short and simple answer is we're the venture capital arm of WARF. What does that mean? Well, we identify attractive investment opportunities, startups. We provide capital to those startups and help them syndicate capital raising from other VCs. And then hopefully we give them strategic guidance to get them to an exit where they provide a good return. So if you're not familiar with WARF, which hopefully everyone here is, WARF manages the technology transfer from the university. So if you have an idea, you come to WARF, disclose your idea. That's taken by a disclosure IP representative of WARF. They'll file a patent around it. A licensing agent would then look at licensing the technology out to either a startup company or to a large company. Where does WARF Ventures play in this process? In the licensing, if it goes to a small startup company, that's where WARF would get involved. WARF Ventures would get involved in the process. That's if we were just a traditional venture capital firm. But we're actually much more than that. Because we're at WARF, because WARF Ventures is part of WARF, there's a mission attached to our jobs as well as just investing capital. That mission is, of course, to create a best-in-class tech transfer office venture capital fund in support of WARF's overall mission. WARF's overall mission is to provide financial support to the university in terms of grants and to help commercialize technology. There are two key components from the WARF Ventures point of view on how to support WARF and its overall mission. And that's really my job. And that is to invest capital such that I can support the WARF endowment, and then to assist WARF technology companies over key early stage hurdles, enabling them to get to market easier. So even though I get involved in investing after the licensing is done, WARF Ventures actually gets to play a role through a lot of the process. I'm meeting regularly with some of the intellectual property and licensing folks at WARF, helping learn what are the deals coming down the pipeline, very similar to what I did when I was working at Acuitive and we had partnered with the incubator. This gives me insight into what are the technologies I might have to do diligence on in the near future, what kind of investment opportunities are going to be ahead of me, that can give me insight into who I need to start talking to as co-investors. It also helps me inform the licensing and IP team members what makes an attractive venture investment opportunity. I leverage their experience and expertise in helping me do due diligence on each of these technologies. But there's other aspects of our mission as well, and that is to help provide gap funding to technologies. Often, when technologies get licensed out, they don't go right into a startup company. In many cases, they'll go through the WARF Accelerator Program or WARF Therapeutics. These combined provide $70 million of non-dilutive gap funding to technology companies. And both of these have been talked about a lot. I'm still going to touch on them very quickly. So the accelerator program run by Greg Keenan, this essentially is $20 million doled out over about 5 or 6 years. It's an allocation of capital to help identify technologies which, if given a grant, could get over some early stage hurdles and become attractive to venture capital or industry. It covers all segments of industry or all segments of university research with the exception of therapeutics. And that's because therapeutics requires a significant additional capital in order to make headway in some of these early stage gap funding programs. The accelerator program has been very successful. There's been 33 license agreements coming out of it, 13 startups, and probably most importantly, for every dollar that the accelerator program put in, there's been $6.50 of follow-on financing brought to the table. So if you're a technology inventor and you get into the accelerator program, it's a great way to leverage the experience of the catalysts and the other folks that are involved in the accelerator program and give you a leg up when you're looking for venture capital. The other program is WARF Therapeutics, and as I mentioned, therapeutic projects take significantly more capital, and therefore the grant sizes that come from the accelerator program wouldn't move the needle very well in therapeutic projects. So there's a larger dollar allocation, $50 million to be spent over the next 8 or so years. This is managed by John Young, another relatively new addition to WARF. What it does, WARF Therapeutics, it bridges the gap between the research being done at the university and big pharma, and by partnering with some CROs, helps to develop up targets, either compounds or biological targets that are well suited for either venture investment or strategic licensing. So what's the investment strategy that we have? Most importantly, the source, where the technologies come from. Since we manage intellectual property for the University of Wisconsin-Madison, my primary focus is investing in WARF licensees, startups that are based on technology coming out of the university. Also, the accelerator program and WARF Therapeutics are prime feeders, as I said earlier, for the ventures program. Secondary efforts are going to be sort of non-WARF licensees, but university startups. This, if you could think of the computer science department, they don't have patents on software over there, but they do have intellectual property that's created on the campus here. So computer science programs that could become the next Facebook, hopefully, would be ripe for WARF investment. Also, we'll look at UW affiliate companies, companies started by alumni, companies that are doing clinical trials or doing sponsored research here on campus. This is lower down on the priority list. It would be an exception to our primary focus, but it would be something we'd consider. And then finally, truly outstanding investment opportunities that have a very tight strategic fit with WARF and the campus. That would be something else that we would consider. But really, it's the primary focus and secondary focus that I'd be looking at. The stage, as I showed earlier, we typically will invest very early. We do a lot of seed investing, mostly in the form of convertible notes, but we also maintain our investment positions where it makes sense with follow-on capital. We have up to 5 or 6, almost $7 million in a couple of deals that we've done already, so we can write fairly decent-sized checks. And then we invest in all segments. I have primarily a healthcare background, but I'll be leveraging a number of in-house technical experts at WARF, but also relying on some colleagues of mine from industry to help me evaluate and look at technologies outside of the healthcare domain. So we will make investments in all areas. And then finally, the size, we'll write checks as small as $50,000 or up to $1 million or even more, depending on what the situation warrants. I really do want to emphasize again that our primary focus is on WARF-related technology. So if you have a license from WARF, that gets you sort of into the fast lane. If you don't, it doesn't mean it's not a possibility, but it's a challenge. It would be an exception for our investment philosophy. So what does a prototypical investment look like for us? Well, typically there'll be somebody ideally at the university that has a great idea. They go to WARF, do the licensing process, make the disclosure. They'll get a license. This is the concept stage. They really don't have any assets yet in the company other than an idea, some intellectual property. They may go through the accelerator program or WARF Therapeutics. They'll get some funding there to help them develop the concept into a company. At that stage, they've done some proof of concept work. And at that point, now that a company exists, that's when WARF Ventures would get involved. we tend to invest significantly and do the heavy lifting at that stage, but we will bring in co-investors, either angels or, where appropriate, established venture groups to co-invest alongside of us. Hopefully the companies will then develop the technology further into a later stage startup company. This is more product and market development. The proof of concept should be well done at this point. Your market should be identified. Your product should be well along the development path and getting ready to launch. And at that point, we expect outside investors to do the majority of the heavy lifting with regard to the capital investment, and we'll continue to participate as long as it makes sense. But again, we expect outside investors to lead most of those rounds. We've got a number of startup resources at WARF. These are just the ones in-house. This is all on the web, which I can get to in a little bit. But this sort of is a highlight of some of the programs we have at WARF to help entrepreneurs with their startups. And then outside of WARF, we have, starting from the inner circle, we have, of course, WARF Ventures, and we have what WARF does, the licensing, intellectual property, the accelerator program, the therapeutics program. There's a lot of D2P and other programs on campus to help entrepreneurs identify, the market need, identify law firms or entrepreneurs they should work with to develop their technologies. And then there's a number of venture groups and other educational platforms around Madison and beyond that can really help entrepreneurs in their path to commercialization. One of the things I think you should take a look at is what are the factors you should consider when starting a company. And I'm not going to list everything here. You can read it, but this is very important because this is where we're going to start with our due diligence when we look at evaluating a startup company for investment. So if you come to us or actually any investor for investment in your startup company and you can't start to answer these questions, maybe you don't have an answer, but you at least can talk to these issues. You've demonstrated that you've thought about them. That's going to go a long way to helping you win over the investor that you've got a value worth, a prospect worth investing in, or at least serious consideration. So take a good hard look at your investment opportunity, start to do the due diligence because we certainly will following that. And then all the information I talked about is on the website, warf.org/ventures. I'm going to be doing an outreach program starting actually tomorrow. I'll spend a half a day a week in this very building, right there, I think, in the oval-shaped building, Wednesday afternoons. And then Thursday afternoons, I'll spend a half a day in the medical school, also open office hours. You can click on the links on the website at WARF Ventures to book some time slots to meet with me. If I'm not booked, you're welcome to stop by and have a discussion. We can talk about the venture process. We can talk about startups. We can talk about whatever you need answered. But that's the formal presentation. I think Paul can come on up now and we can start to have a little bit of a chat.
Well, thanks, Mike. Welcome again. Glad to have you here. A couple questions on the presentation just to get some background I think a lot of us are familiar with the normal WARF process, patent disclosures licensing. Could you just expand a little bit more about the accelerator program, how that works? Is the company forming beforehand or in conjunction with the accelerator program? Are you vetting technologies? What's involved in that process, and how do the scientists and founders interact with it?
I'm wired. Yeah. That's a great question. So the accelerator program and WARF Therapeutics both deal with projects. They don't deal with companies. So that's an important distinction. So inventors who have licensed technology from WARF, they can be working on a technology pre-company stage and do research, get grants, continue the development, the baking, if you will, on the campus. And I think that's very important because venture capital is probably the most expensive capital you can raise. And once you take that capital, you've given up very precious equity at arguably a very low valuation. So you've given up a lot for a little bit of capital. Whatever you can develop on campus using university resources, which is a lot more readily available than what you'd have to pay for if you were a startup company,
you can take technologies much further along and probably at a faster pace than going out and trying to fundraise capital. So it's better to stay as a project, work through the accelerator program, make some headway, and then become a company. The accelerator program won't actually take companies in. You've got to be a project. Greg Keenan runs that program. They have a number of industry experts that they call catalysts that look at, they regularly meet with Greg and look at candidates coming into the program as to which ones should be identified as candidates that would benefit from having a little bit of grant funding to get them over some early stage hurdles. And so those companies design a project, milestone, a prototype, a clinical study, some market research, something that will really help build the value in that technology and get it venture ready. So it's definitely not a company at that stage, but it's getting close to it. It's a proto company at that stage.
And the money for that is coming from WARF?
That's money coming from WARF. It's a $20 million allocation to the accelerator program to be paid out over about, I think it's about 7 or 8 years. And it's about $2 million or so a year.
And so once I get through if I'm a founder out there, I get through the accelerator program, I've now kind of graduated, if you will, into forming a company. Can you kind of walk us through what would be the capital path that WARF would like to kind of go on? I get how we'll set up a founder, we're each going to take our ownership percentage, but then kind of what's WARF's role? Does it come in, how the financing looks, and how it wants it to look?
Well, ideally, the entrepreneur will have made great progress through the accelerator program or WARF Therapeutics, and the technology is very venture ready. A company is formed at that point. Maybe they find a good lawyer. Maybe you can help them with that, identifying one. They've created a company. We're not going to be your lawyer for you. We're not going to set up the company for you. We're going to be an investor in you, and so because of that, the law firms, et cetera, they have to represent the company and not represent WARF. So we're a separate entity at that point. We should be treated like any other investor. But you'd create a company. You'd come to WARF saying, we've got a license. We're looking to fundraise. Here's our development plan. We're looking to raise X number of dollars to last us X number of months, and this is what we're going to achieve. It's really important for entrepreneurs, especially when identifying the first VCs they want to go to, that they have a well thought out milestone plan. Think about where you are, where you need to get to. That's a fundable milestone. And what do I mean by that? That's a milestone that is going to remove a significant amount of risk from the project. Whether it's a first-in-man study, it's building a prototype, or it's solving a problem with regard to your technology that removes some of the risk. And venture investors will reward you by then making another investment in your company. You've removed some risk, so they will invest further. What you don't want to have happen is you sketch out a budget, you say, I need $1 million, but the million gets you halfway there. You realize you haven't removed any risk. You have to go back to your investors and ask them for more money when you haven't demonstrated you've removed risk from the project. One, if you're able to get capital at that point, it'll probably be on very unfavorable terms. As I stated in the beginning, it's very important to have a milestone plan where you can map out on a time basis how much capital you need to raise to get you from point A to point B, and what are the critical steps along the way. Then they're going to ask you, okay, what do you do beyond that? So you really need to start laying the groundwork for mapping out the project all the way through to commercialization, whether that's acquisition, product launch, cash flow positive status, what have you. You need to think through what's it going to take from a capital perspective, from a time perspective, from a resource perspective.
And so, Mike, I've gone through the program, I'm ready to go. To come present to you, what's kind of the ideal characteristics of a company that you'd like to see come out of the accelerator program? Clearly, you guys have been nurturing them along, getting them ready. That doesn't necessarily mean WARF Ventures is going to come in, or maybe it does, but what are you looking for?
Ideally, I'd love to have an inventor who is passionate about their technology, has done their research, has either identified a startup CEO, or is open to having an entrepreneur who's been there, done that, help them with creating a company around the technology. A red flag to me is an academic researcher who's invented the next widget, and they feel that only they know enough about this technology to turn it into a product. And only they should be the person then to run the company developing that project. That's a red flag. It's rare. It's the rare person who is a brilliant enough inventor to come up with the idea, but also has the same skill sets to manage the hurdles that an early stage company has to overcome, and then grow that company into a larger company that can mass produce the device, distribute the device, sell the device, etc. So it's a rare individual. If you are that person, great, I want to talk to you. But realistically, there's very few folks that are like that out there. You don't see many of the Mark Zuckerbergs or Bill Gates out there in the world. Ideally, the person comes to me and they say, I want to start a company because I think this should be commercialized. Help me do that. Help me identify a CEO. Help me, think about the milestones. Let's develop a plan. As an early stage venture capitalist, we often help develop those plans. It's great if you've thought them through. We're going to kind of pick it apart anyway and give you advice on what you should be doing to commercialize your technology even better. But be open to coaching. As I said, don't feel like you need to run everything. And other than that, educate me. Be patient with me, because it's hard being a venture capitalist when you have to look at every industry segment to get yourself up to speed on it. So be patient with your venture capitalists if you're an entrepreneur trying to educate them on the investment opportunity. It takes us a while to get ourselves up to speed.
And so for some of the investors in the group that are out there, including myself, when, once you've found the next great widget, when are we going to be able to write checks and sit side by side you? When are you going to include us in the process?
Sure. Well, also, I need to answer a question you brought up to earlier, and that is about licensing. I should let you guys know, just because you have a license from WARF doesn't guarantee you're going to get venture investment from WARF. The two are both in the same entity, but they're different arms of the entity. And so licensing is handled through a different group. Ventures is focusing on getting venture returns and getting companies over early hurdles. Two totally different processes. So getting a license doesn't equate to guaranteeing yourself venture funding. Now, where do we get other investors involved? I love it if investors want to come in early with us, because generally you want to share the risk if you can. Depending on the size of the investment round, as I said, we've written some small checks, 50,000, 200,000. Some VCs might feel that's a little too small or too early for them, and I understand that. Those would probably be a convertible note into a later round, but would be open to working with investors at a very early stage, with the expectation that they are going to co-invest alongside with us. And as I stated earlier in the slide, as it gets further in the process, we get more co-investors doing the heavy lifting for funding the companies rather than WARF Ventures.
And then probably my last question, then we'll open it up to the crowd, is we saw from your initial slide that you've got a lot of touch points really all over the country. How will you, one of the things I think could really bring to the table here is being able to tap into that network and help syndicate deals here. How will you approach that as a company kind of goes through and matures in the process?
Well, one of the things that's very exciting for me about coming to Madison and coming to this role is, the great research that's going on here. Number 6 in the nation as far as federally funded research. Lots of, entrepreneurs, a very vibrant community. What we have at WARF especially is a lot of technology, and we have a venture fund. We don't have, a ton of venture capitalists with $200-300 million funds locally. We've got some good investors, like venture investors right there. I see Paul. We have some co-investors in town. We don't have a ton of deep-pocketed co-investors around here. We also don't have a lot of experienced management teams. Entrepreneurs who have been there and done that 3-4 times in the past and learned the lessons that startup entrepreneurs and management teams need to learn in order to be successful. So one of the challenges that I face is reaching out not only to the local investor base, but also trying to find the VCs on the coast that are interested in certain segments or technologies that we have, and convincing them to take a harder look at investing in the region. And then also reaching out to management teams. Entrepreneurs I've worked with in the past that have worked in cancer diagnostics or medical device and neuromodulation, and recruiting them to work on a project here, relocating a company maybe to another area, but taking the company to a place where it has a better chance of success. And success to me is both getting a good venture return and getting the technology to market.
I lied, I have one more question. When do you actually go, or maybe you are already, are you live and going and the process has started and you're already reviewing, or is there going to be a specific launch date?
That's a great question. Today's been a very busy day for me because today we actually had the first deal team diligence meeting. Part of the venture office responsibility was sort of revising and revamping the policies and procedures of how we do due diligence, what's the stereotypical deal we're going to do, some of which I just talked about. And today we had our first meeting with a number of licensing and IP folks at WARF who are assisting me with the due diligence. We went through about 6 companies already that we've kicked off diligence on. We're hoping to start getting that diligence completed and making investments in the community very soon. So we're live now.
Awesome. All right, well, I guess I'd open up to the crowd. I can walk around with the mic if anybody has questions for Mike.
So 2 questions. Are you still going to require a VC lead in order to invest? And secondly, my deal's been in front of you for a while. Am I in the queue?
Good to see you too, back. Right now, WARF's official policy, how the venture office works, is we require a lead for investment amounts beyond $250,000. WARF policy for a number of years. We're working on changing that with the trustees. It takes a little bit of time. One person can't change the direction of a 92-year-old organization overnight. With that said, your deal is in the queue. There are challenges. We want to see more co-investors taking the lead, as I mentioned. And so, my challenge back to you is bring that qualified co-investor lead to the table, and would be very happy to partake in a round.
So I raised $16.5 million. Who is the lead to be?
Whoever's going to be giving you money from a deep-pocketed fund right now. You're out looking for capital. Challenge. You've made it very clear how challenging it is, and I appreciate that. And I've been in your situation fundraising. With that said, WARF is not in a position to continue investing in companies if there isn't industry venture support for that company. It may.
Okay, just want to clarify, that was only, you need to have a single lead for that 250. Can't be a group that goes over that.
No. We're able to lead a convertible note for a $250,000 or under.
Okay.
But if we're talking about $1 million round, we'd want to get an industry lead.
I might have missed it in your presentation, but how big is the venture arm that's being opened now?
Well, the total portfolio is $110 million. Of that, about $50 million has already been invested in startups, so a ballpark of 55 to 60 million free capital to invest. When that's been deployed, assuming the funds performed well, assuming I've performed well, Eric Iverson and myself would go back to the trustees, put in a request to get an additional allocation of venture funding capital, and then be back in the market funding.
Can you talk a little bit about the risk management you do around IP by way of patents, trademarks, all those licenses, et cetera?
Well, that's really a question for the WARF IP department. We take IP into consideration when we look at deals. So obviously, if we're comfortable with the intellectual property, being that it's a WARF piece of IP, and we're comfortable with it, and we make an investment, shows that we're comfortable with that piece of IP. Investor out there to do their own diligence on IP. Yes.
The $60 million can be spent through how long?
But how long is that expected to last? There's not a schedule. In other words, I'm not guided to do $5 million a year for 10 or 12 years or $10 million a year for 5 years. There's no
Okay.
schedule for it. You can't really schedule innovation. So the goal is to create some number of companies a year around, WARF technologies. Could be 4 or 5, 6, and then it of course depends on how much capital each of those companies require. So exactly, yeah. So the capital will be deployed over time. There'll be reserves held for follow-on investment within individual investments, within individual deals. And as the funds get down, that's when Eric and I would be going to.
I have two questions. First one is, how much runway do you prefer to fund on any given round? And secondly, how does the WARF accelerator program interact or interface with D2P?
The first question, it really varies based on the project. As I mentioned earlier, it's important to identify the milestone, the fundable milestone, as one that removes significant risk from the project. That may be removed in 6 months, it may take a year. I can't answer that for every company. It's something inherent in the individual project. But you should have that well thought out and present it. If it makes sense to fund for a year or 2 years, then your investors should be open to that idea. They wouldn't want to only partially invest in a project, get it halfway, and then have to invest again. If it makes sense and there's a rational argument for funding it for 2 years, then that's what your investor base should be willing to fund it through. The second question was, how does D2P interface with the accelerator program? Well, the accelerator program is within WARF. D2P is separate, funded through the university, but they interface actually quite a bit. Greg Keenan, I know, is constantly referring companies over to, or projects, I should say, over to D2P for, going through their process, learning how to find product market fit, et cetera. So I believe the two entities work pretty closely in hand. Greg may be here in the audience. I know Andy's here from D2P, so you could maybe talk directly with him and get a little more color if I haven't answered your question or not.
Can I ask you to take a little bit of a step back and look at the Wisconsin and the Midwest ecosystem? In that, like, compared to especially software, you have a lot of people switching between companies, and there's a lot of diffusion of the essentially the startup skills. And I don't think it seems that in biotech there isn't nearly as much diffusion, and if there is, it's always behind closed doors. You don't see people writing blogs about their biotech, and that really, challenges the the grad student who's trying to figure out, do I actually want to do this? Because when you're in your lab, all that you see around you are the professors, and that track is very well beaten, and you just don't know at all, and you aren't getting credit or whatever for figuring out that alternative path. So can you think about WARF's role in that regard?
That's a really good question. It's one of the challenges I think non-hub areas face, because there's great innovation and research being done here, but you're not bumping up next to people as closely as you would be, say, in Cambridge or the Bay Area or whatnot. So I would challenge you to do a little bit more reach out. WARF can maybe facilitate. I haven't thought about exactly how we may do that, but there may be a role for WARF to help facilitate people within certain research areas having more mixers. One of the exciting programs I like is Forward Biolabs. And when I helped start NEOS, we were a university spin out. We raised $6 or so million, and like $1.5 to $2 million of that went to building a building, and that got outfitted. Everybody was secretive about not wanting to share space with other companies, and it took us 6 months to get qualified with vendors to be able to get reagents and stuff. And now the shared lab space concept, which is really taking off in the coast, is also taking place here. And I find it really exciting because you get researchers in companies that are willing to share a lab with a totally different company. They get up and running much faster. It's cheaper, easier to start a company. You get the intellectual interchange between companies and people that you wouldn't get under the old model. So maybe Forward Biolabs should have some mixers with different departments at the med school or chemistry or whatnot, and bring people together more and just have some of that kind of informal, discourse. Yes.
You might have already touched on this a little bit. At what point, like for sake of biologic or a device or something, is the WARF looking to get involved at? Like, is it from the initial stages of like, an IRB approval, once it's been FDA approved, or once you have like a concrete product that?
We'll definitely get involved earlier than FDA approval.
Sure.
We get in fairly early. If it's a therapeutic, you certainly should talk to John Young about what is available in non-dilutive capital funding. He's got $50 million in that program. John's in the audience somewhere, over there in that corner, about as far away from you as he could get. But he's got $50 million in that program. He might be able to answer a little more clearly what role they can play in helping advance a project through to get it venture ready without having to take that venture capital and start the clock ticking. But we generally get involved fairly early in the process. More questions? Oh, here we go.
What will be the transition from WARF AP to like WARF Venture? It's like WARF Venture will periodically to look through the WARF AP's portfolio, or WARF AP sometime it will recommend some company like to WARF Venture.
It's not that formal a process, the interface between the accelerator program and WARF Ventures. Greg's office is right down the hall. We meet, fairly regularly as projects go through the accelerator program. Just by nature of discussing things with him, I hear about the exciting technologies and the progress they make, and that cues them up to become venture ready. I can even start meeting with the companies as they're going through meeting with the individuals as they're going through the program to help them with the decision, do they want to create a company or not? Would WARF Ventures be interested? So it's not a formal application process between accelerator to ventures. It's just a natural progression as you go through the accelerator program. If the project is successful, if it's removed some risk, the gap funding has done its job, and then it tees it up for a venture investment, that's when I would get involved. Yes?
Yeah, so my lab works on synthetic biology, and one of the questions, and as we develop technologies, one question that I constantly grapple with is there a commercial product here, right? And so you can look around, look for companies that do similar things, and that kind of gives you an idea. But oftentimes as a faculty, I'm still several steps removed from even being able to competently make that assessment, right? So can you envision a role for WARF in even helping us figure that out?
First of all, let me congratulate you. Just the fact that you're self-aware enough to recognize that you're not sure there's a product there gives you a leg up on some researchers I met with who, think that there's definitely a product there. It's just not been found yet. So congratulations on recognizing that you're not sure yet if you have a product. I don't have that level of Again, I think D2P would be a great resource for you to go to for that exact issue. They're designed to help address, D2P stands for discovery to product. So it helps researchers think through what is the market potential for this technology. Is there a fit? Do people want to pay for it? That's something that, I could help you out with over coffee or something like that, but really it's better suited to go through those kinds of channels.
Are there domain experts in D2P?
Yes.
Thank you.
You pointed out that we have a little bit of a management team issue in recruiting talent to Madison that's kind of experienced. Do you have any plans to train up talent rather than recruiting it back to Madison? Maybe starting more grassroots, rolling out some, rather than product-specific incubators, but entrepreneur incubators?
That's an interesting idea. From WARF's perspective, we're not an economic development engine. I'd love it if there were, well-trained management teams here to develop the companies and keep them local. We don't have state funding to develop companies here or to create jobs here. We're really about commercializing the technology that can take place in Madison. It can take place on the coast. I would be supportive of those efforts to train up management teams. Sometimes, though, it just, it takes battle scars, having been through it. And I don't know how well you can train for that. You can try. I just think that actually doing it and being in those situations is the best training. So how do you train for that without actually doing it? If you can figure out a way to do that, I think the area would benefit from it. Right. Oh, and one. Oh.
So I have one son, he lives in Seattle, and another son lives in San Diego, and another, my brother-in-law lives in Boston, and he's a venture capitalist. And if you go to the universities in those cities, it's hard to find a faculty member who's not involved in some kind of startup. It's hard to actually be anybody if you're not involved in some kind of startup. I mean, Seattle is just a buzz. But that's also true at Stanford and MIT. It seems like every faculty member is thinking about it. If you held a forum like this in one of those cities, it would be filled with faculty. But it's not here. It's almost the flip side opposite in Madison. You have 2,000 faculty, but you have 20 that show up to an event like this. Whereas if you had this in Stanford or MIT and said, we've got 15 million or 50 million in venture capital money, it's coming straight out of a friendly funding agency, there'd be a lot more people here. So there's other differences with Seattle and San Diego and Boston. Is here, there's a lot, it's an ag school. There's a lot of, we have the medical school, we have the ag school, but there's no ag school at Berkeley. There's no ag school at Stanford or MIT. So there's things that are distinctly different about the Madison scene that if you're coming from Boston or Seattle or San Diego, you're almost shocked at what you see. And I was wondering if you think that needs to change, or are you just going to live with the way the culture is here? And if you want it to change, how do you see that changing?
Well, I don't think an individual person or even an entity like WARF could change the culture of the university. So I also don't think you should try. I think, I've been involved in a number of different cities that have wanted to be the next Silicon Valley. And it's impossible to duplicate that. It was kind of a work of just nature and how the ecosystem evolved. So I think it's more important to play to your strengths and shore up your weaknesses. I try to think about that professionally, and I say UW-Madison should think about that as well. So does that mean that I'm going to be spending a lot more time looking at ag and bio deals? Yes, I am. I'm learning more about animal vaccines than I ever thought I would before.
So one specific question is this: we have 2,000 faculty members here. Very few of them are interested in starting companies. Very few of them file patent applications. Yet they bring in millions and millions of dollars in federal grants. Each of them can do that. And so to me, that seems like a major thing that if you don't change it, then you've got a problem.
It's a problem that they're bringing in millions and millions of dollars of federal research. That doesn't sound like a problem. It sounds like what you're saying, the problem is that they're not translating the research into startup companies. Well, the interesting thing is not every technology should become a company, or should become a startup company, I should say. There's absolutely nothing wrong with taking your technology and licensing it to the big companies. I went through that sort of process of what WARF does, and then the bifurcation, it either goes to a big company or a startup. If the majority of the innovations here are licensable to large, established, Midwestern, ag or bio companies, there's nothing wrong with that needs fixing, so to speak. I think what you're getting at is maybe there should be more interest in starting companies in other areas that maybe Wisconsin isn't known for right now, or maybe could be doing a better job of. And there, I think it's just, time and energy at trying to, create something of value that is attractive to investors and getting attention. Rome's not built in a day, and if we want to create more biotech startups in Madison, it's probably going to take a little bit of time to make it happen. But along the way, if you continue to, play to your strengths, continue getting the research dollars, that's going to, there's going to be a trickle-down effect, if you will, that's going to benefit the overall startup community, whether it's more startups in that space or in biotech or comp sci or whatever. I can't help but think more research is going to benefit the area. I think one more question.
One more for you. So what is your opinion on SBIR, STTR versus venture funding for early stage tech coming out of universities?
I'm a huge fan. Non-dilutive capital that advances the technology and removes the risk, I'm all for. The big question always comes down to is the time of writing the grant worthwhile? Because the phase ones are usually 100,000, 120,000. I think they've gone up recently. The real jackpot's when you get to the phase two, and you get like $1 million. If you have a team that's good at writing SBIRs, Intralace, the ophthalmic laser company I talked about earlier, they had a 100% hit rate, I think. They had like 8 SBIRs. That brought in, $10 million or so of non-dilutive capital to the company. We were a small, EDF Ventures was a small Midwestern venture capital fund, $30 million, $5 million. Have SBIR and STTR money come in to help develop the technology so that our dollars got leveraged that much further. I'm a big fan. Most of the inventors are probably good at writing grants anyway. These need to have a little bit of a commercialization slant to them. So as long as you partner with people or entities that do that. I know in Ann Arbor there was a group, name right now, but they consulting firm that actually specialized in helping write SBIR grants from the business and commercialization aspect that most inventors and researchers are lacking. And so partnering with an entity like that to help you write the grants, if it can bring in the capital, I'm all for it. I have to take this question. This is my wife.
Hi. It's actually not a question for you. I just wanted to comment on the other audience members' question about Boston, Seattle. So we just moved here from the Bay Area, and I've been working at Stanford for 20 years in their tech transfer office, and I'm actually still working in that office. So there's probably something like 2,000 professors at Stanford, and most of them don't know our office. So it's a very small subset of that faculty population that are inventors, and it's even a smaller population of those inventors who are interested in doing startups. I would say the typical startup that we're involved with is inventor affiliated, and usually it's a postdoc and a professor are the two inventors, and it's usually the postdoc that's really taking the charge and is writing up the business plan and is really interested in this, whereas the faculty tend to be co-founders, they tend to chair the SAP, they don't tend to leave the university. So really, I would say the driving force of most of the startups that I've seen go through our office is really being driven by postdocs, sometimes grad students, sometimes by PIs, but not so much. And I'm not quite sure how you would translate that here or anywhere else, but it's just kind of just something I've noted, an observation. As far as kind of making it a more entrepreneurial environment here, I think it's going to really start with success, and it's probably going to start at 1 or 2. And then I think other people will go to a department meeting and they'll present really interesting data, and somebody in the audience will probably say, have you talked to OTL? You should go talk to OTL about this. We've gotten a lot of referrals like that where they've said, it didn't even occur to me to come talk to you, but somebody in the lab or somebody in the department pointed me your way. And also, actually, I've just had a professor reach out to me yesterday where Third Rock Ventures in Boston, and they're in the Bay Area, they do a ton of company formation. And so this person wasn't looking to start a company, and I don't think that's what the conversation is about, but there are a lot of venture firms that are very interested in company formation. They're very interested in certain technologies, and they're going out and finding the researchers and reaching out, and that might be a consulting relationship, it might be academic co-founder relationship. But I just wanted to share some of the experience I've had coming from, a university that's known to be very entrepreneurial.
Thank you. Now you know why I married her.